Have you ever wondered if your children really love you or if they just pretend out of obligation? My name is Margaret, I'm 68 years old, and I spent my whole life believing that love was about giving everything you had to the people you care about most. I thought that if I sacrificed enough, worked hard enough, and loved deeply enough, my daughter would understand how much she meant to me. But sometimes, dear friends, love isn't enough to bridge the gap between two hearts that speak different languages. If you've ever felt that distance from your own children, please hit that like button because this story might help you understand that you're not alone in this struggle. I live in a small house in Portland, Oregon, the same house where I raised my daughter Sarah after my husband passed away 5 years ago. Robert was a good man, worked at the factory for 32 years until his heart gave out one cold December morning. Sarah was 27 then, already living her own life in the city, working at some office job that I never quite understood but was proud of anyway. When Robert died, I thought Sarah and I would grow closer, that grief would bring us together like it does in the movies. Instead, it seemed to push us further apart, like two boats drifting in opposite directions on a quiet lake. Sarah is 32 now, a beautiful woman with her father's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. She's smart, much smarter than I ever was, and she has this way of speaking that makes you feel like you should apologize for not knowing better. I remember when she was little, maybe 8 or 9, and she would come home from school full of stories about her day. She would sit at our old kitchen table, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor yet, and tell me about her friends and her teachers and the books she was reading. Those were the best times when my little girl still wanted to share her world with me. But somewhere along the way those conversations stopped. Maybe it was when she went to college on that scholarship I worked 3 jobs to help pay for. I cleaned offices at night, worked at the grocery store during the day, and took in sewing on the weekends. My hands were always raw from the cleaning chemicals and my back ached something terrible, but every dollar I earned went toward making sure Sarah had everything she needed. I wanted her to have opportunities one never had, to go places I could never go. When Sarah graduated and got her job in the city, I was so proud I could hardly contain myself. I called everyone I knew to tell them about my daughter's success. But when she came home for visits, which became less and less frequent, she seemed different. She spoke to me like I was a child who didn't understand the real world. When I asked about her work, she would give me short answers and change the subject. When I tried to share stories about my day or the neighbors, she would look at her phone or find an excuse to leave the room. I kept trying though. I sent her care packages with her favorite cookies that I spent hours baking. I called every week, usually on Sunday evenings, hoping to catch her when she might have a few minutes to talk. Most of the time she seemed rushed, like talking to her mother was just another chore on her long list of things to do. I told myself she was just busy, that young people today live different lives than we did when we were their age. After her father died, I hoped things might change. I thought maybe Sarah would see that life is short and family is what matters most. But if anything, she became more distant. She came to the funeral, of course, and she handled all the arrangements because she said I was too emotional to think clearly. She wasn't wrong about that. Losing Robert after 35 years of marriage felt like losing half of myself. But the way she took charge, so cold and efficient, made me feel like I was watching a stranger organize my husband's goodbye. The house felt so empty after the funeral. Robert's chair sat empty in the living room, and I couldn't bring myself to move his coffee cup from the kitchen counter for 3 weeks. I started having little conversations with him, telling him about my day, asking him what he thought I should do about Sarah. I know it sounds foolish, but sometimes I could almost hear his voice telling me to be patient, that our daughter loved us in her own way. I tried to fill the loneliness by keeping busy. I volunteered at the community center helping serve lunch to seniors who had even less than I did. I tended to my small garden, growing tomatoes and cucumbers that I would can for the winter. I kept the house exactly as Robert liked it, dusting his tools in the garage and keeping his side of the bed made up neat and tidy. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the silence between Sarah and me grew louder every day. My neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, is 75 and has lived next door for 20 years. She's one of those women who notices everything and isn't afraid to speak her mind. She would come over for coffee sometimes and she could see how much I missed having Sarah around. "That girl doesn't know how good she has it, Mrs. Wilson would say, stirring sugar into her cup with more force than necessary. Not every mother would have done what you did for her. But I would always defend Sarah, telling Mrs. Wilson that she was just busy building her career, that she would come around when she was ready. The truth is, I made excuses for Sarah because I couldn't bear to admit that maybe I had failed as a mother. Maybe all those years of working multiple jobs meant I wasn't home enough when she needed me. Maybe my lack of education made her embarrassed of me. Maybe she resented the fact that we never had much money, even though I tried to give her everything I could. I replayed conversations from her childhood, looking for clues about where I had gone wrong. About 6 months ago, Sarah started calling even less. Our Sunday conversations became every other Sunday than once a month. When I asked if everything was okay, she would say she was fine, just busy with work and her social life. I didn't know much about her friends or if she was seeing anyone special. She had stopped sharing those details with me years ago, and when I asked, she would say things like, "You wouldn't understand," or, "It's complicated." I started having chest pains around that time, sharp little reminders that my body wasn't as strong as it used to be. I didn't want to worry Sarah, so I didn't mention them during our brief phone calls. Martinez at the clinic said my blood pressure was too high and gave me pills to take, but they made me dizzy and confused. I stopped taking them after a few weeks because I didn't like how they made me feel. 3 months ago, I fell in the kitchen while making dinner. I was reaching for a pot on the high shelf, something I had done thousands of times before, when suddenly my vision went dark and I found myself on the floor with a terrible pain in my chest. Mrs. Wilson heard the crash and came over with her spare key. She found me conscious but scared, clutching my chest and trying to catch my breath. The ambulance ride to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. The paramedic, a kind young man who reminded me of Sarah when she was trying to be helpful, kept asking me questions about my medical history and who they should call. I gave them Sarah's number, hoping she would come, hoping this scare would remind her that I wouldn't be around forever. She did come, eventually, after her workday was finished. She seemed more annoyed than worried, asking the doctors practical questions about insurance and treatment options rather than sitting with me and holding my hand. "Mom, you really need to take better care of yourself," she said, standing at the foot of my hospital bed with her arms crossed. "You can't keep living alone if you're going to have episodes like this." Episodes. That's what she called them, like my heart problems were just inconvenient interruptions to her schedule. The doctors kept me for 3 days, running tests and adjusting medications. Sarah visited once each day, usually during her lunch break, and she spent most of the time on her phone or talking to the nurses about discharge procedures. I tried to tell her about how scared I had been, how much I missed her father during moments like these, but she would cut me off with practical advice about eating better and getting more exercise. When I got home, Mrs. Wilson helped me get settled and stocked my refrigerator with easy meals. Sarah had already gone back to her regular life, promising to call and check on me but not offering to stay even one night to make sure I was okay. I sat in Robert's chair that evening, looking around our quiet house and feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. The chest pains continued, coming and going like unwelcome visitors. Sometimes they were sharp and sudden, taking my breath away while I was folding laundry or watching television. Other times they were dull and persistent, like a heavy weight pressing down on my heart. I learned to sit very still when they came, breathing slowly and waiting for them to pass. I didn't call Sarah about them because I knew she would just worry about the expense of another hospital visit. 2 weeks ago, I had what I now know was a massive heart attack. I was in my garden, picking the last tomatoes before the first frost, when the pain hit me like a truck. This wasn't like the other episodes. This was a crushing, overwhelming agony that spread through my chest and down my left arm. I tried to call for help, but no sound came out of my mouth. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't support me. Mrs. Wilson found me an hour later, collapsed between the tomato plants with dirt still clutched in my right hand. She called 911 and rode with me to the hospital, holding my hand and telling me over and over that everything would be okay. The last thing I remember before the darkness took over was hearing her tell the paramedics to call Sarah, and hoping that this time my daughter would understand how much I needed her. When I woke up, I wasn't really awake at all. I could hear everything around me. The beeping machines, the hushed conversations of nurses, the sound of Sarah's voice talking to doctors about my condition. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even open my eyes. It was like being trapped in my own body, aware of everything but unable to respond to anything. Martinez explained to Sarah that I was in a deep coma, that the heart attack had been severe and my brain wasn't getting enough oxygen for several critical minutes. He used words like irreversible damage, and minimal brain activity, and very unlikely to recover. I wanted to scream that I could hear every word, that I was still here, still fighting, but my body wouldn't obey my mind. Sarah listened to the doctor's explanation with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. She asked about life support, about medical decisions, about what would happen next. I heard her making phone calls to people I didn't even know she knew, arranging time off from work and dealing with what she called the situation. Not once did I hear her cry or tell me she loved me or beg me to fight harder to come back to her. After 5 days of tests and consultations, Dr. Martinez told Sarah that there was no hope for recovery. My brain scans showed too much damage and the machines were the only things keeping my body alive. He gently suggested that it might be time to consider letting me go, that keeping me on life support would only prolong the inevitable. Sarah agreed immediately without hesitation, asking only about the practical details of organ donation and funeral arrangements. I wanted to fight, wanted to prove them all wrong, but my body felt like it belonged to someone else. I could feel myself slipping away bit by bit like sand running through an hourglass. The sounds around me became fainter, and sometimes I couldn't tell if the voices I heard were real or just echoes from my memories. But I held on somehow because I wasn't ready to leave Sarah, even if she seemed ready to let me go. The strangest thing about being dead, or what everyone thought was dead, is how much you can still hear. I don't know how to explain it to you, friends, but imagine being in a deep, dark room where you can't move or speak, but every sound comes to you crystal clear, like someone turned up the volume on the whole world. That's where I was for 3 days after they moved me to the funeral home, lying in that cold satin-lined box, listening to my own goodbye. If you've ever wondered what people would say about you after you're gone, let me tell you, sometimes it's better not to know. But please, take a moment to hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to tell you might change how you think about the people closest to you. The funeral home smelled like flowers and sadness, that heavy, sweet scent that tries to cover up death but only makes it more obvious. I could hear people walking around me, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor, their voices hushed like they were in church. Sarah had picked out everything: the casket, the flowers, the music, even the dress they put on me. I recognized it as the blue one I wore to her college graduation, the one she said made me look presentable. The viewing started at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. I heard Sarah greeting people at the door, thanking them for coming with that polite voice she used when she wanted to sound proper. "Thank you so much for being here," she kept saying over and over like a recording. Mother would have appreciated it. Not my mother, or mom, just mother, like I was some formal person she barely knew. Mrs. Wilson was one of the first to arrive. I heard her sensible shoes clicking across the floor, and then she was standing right next to my casket. "Oh, Margaret," she whispered, and I could tell she was crying. "You look peaceful, honey. You look like you're just sleeping." She stayed there for a long time and I wished I could squeeze her hand, could tell her how much her friendship had meant to me all these years. More neighbors came throughout the afternoon. Peterson from 2 houses down, who I used to bake cookies for when his wife was sick. The ladies from the community center where I volunteered. People from church who I hadn't seen in months but who remembered me anyway. They all said kind things, talking about how I was always willing to help, how I made the best apple pie at the church bake sale, how I never missed sending a card when someone was sick or grieving. But Sarah stood by the guest book like a store clerk, shaking hands and accepting condolences with that same distant politeness she showed everyone. When people told stories about me, about times I had helped them or made them laugh, Sarah would just nod and say, "That sounds like her," or, "How nice." Like she was hearing about a stranger. Around 4 o'clock, I heard a voice I didn't recognize, a woman about Sarah's age. "I'm so sorry for your loss," the woman said. "Your mother must have been very special." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "It's been difficult, but we're managing." "Were you too close?" the woman asked. There was a pause and I found myself holding my breath, if dead people can do such a thing. "We had our differences," Sarah said finally. Mother was from a different generation. She had very traditional ideas about family and relationships. Traditional ideas. Like love and loyalty were old-fashioned concepts that modern people had outgrown. The woman made sympathetic noises and moved on, but Sarah's words stayed with me, echoing in that strange space between life and death where I found myself trapped. Traditional ideas. Is that what she called the 32 years I spent putting her needs before my own? As the afternoon wore on, I began to notice something that broke my heart even more than Sarah's coldness. She wasn't grieving. She was performing. When people hugged her, she hugged back, but it was mechanical, like she had rehearsed it. When they told her she was handling everything so well, she would give a small, sad smile and say something about how I would have wanted her to be strong. But there were no tears. No moments where she had to step outside to compose herself. No times when someone's memory of me made her laugh or cry or show any real emotion at all. She moved through that room like she was at a business meeting, checking items off a list, making sure everything went smoothly. The evening viewing was busier. More people from work, some of Sarah's old high school classmates who had known me when they were teenagers hanging around our kitchen table. I heard bits and pieces of conversations, people sharing memories I had forgotten about. How I used to drive carloads of kids to school events when other parents were too busy. How I always had extra dinner on Sundays for anyone who wanted to stay. How I never missed a single one of Sarah's school plays or soccer games, even when I was working double shifts. Your mom was like a second mother to half the kids in our class, I heard one woman tell Sarah. She was always so generous with her time and her home. Yes, Sarah said. She was very involved. Like I was meddling instead of loving. Around 7:30 the crowd began to thin out. Most of the neighbors had paid their respects and gone home to their own families. The church ladies had left after making sure Sarah had enough food for the next few days. Only a handful of people remained, talking quietly among themselves while Sarah dealt with the funeral director about tomorrow's service. That's when I heard a conversation that changed everything. Sarah was standing near the back of the room with a young woman I didn't recognize, someone about her age with a sharp voice and expensive-sounding shoes. They thought they were far enough away that no one would overhear them, but sound travels strangely when you're lying in a casket, and I heard every single word. "How are you holding up?" the woman asked. Sarah sighed, and for the first time all day her voice sounded real instead of rehearsed. "Honestly, Jessica, I'm relieved." Relieved. The word hit me like a physical blow. "I know that sounds terrible," Sarah continued, "but living with the guilt has been exhausting. Every phone call, every visit, feeling like nothing I did was ever enough for her." "Don't feel bad about being relieved," Jessica said. "Some relationships are just toxic even with family. Especially with family. My daughter thought our relationship was toxic. The truth is," Sarah said, and I could hear her moving closer to Jessica, lowering her voice even more, "I haven't felt anything real for her in years. I know I'm supposed to be devastated, I know I should be crying and falling apart, but I just feel empty. Like I'm going through the motions because it's what people expect." My heart, which the doctor said was barely beating, felt like it stopped completely. Haven't felt anything real for her in years. My own daughter, my only child, the person I loved more than my own life, felt nothing for me. "When did it start?" Jessica asked. "The disconnect, I mean." Sarah was quiet for a moment and I could hear her thinking. "I don't know exactly. Maybe when I went to college and realized how different other families were. How my friends' mothers didn't call them every day or send care packages every week. How they had their own lives and interests beyond their children. Helicopter parenting," Jessica said knowingly. "Exactly. And it only got worse after Dad died. She became so needy, so dependent on me for emotional support. Every conversation was about how lonely she was, how much she missed him, how worried she was about me. It was suffocating. Suffocating. I thought I was showing love, but she experienced it as suffocation. I started dreading her phone calls," Sarah continued. "I would see her name on my phone and feel this wave of resentment, I guess. Because I knew it would be 20 minutes of her telling me about her garden and her aches and pains and asking me when I was going to visit again." "That's not healthy," Jessica agreed. "You can't be responsible for your parents' happiness." "But that's exactly what she expected," Sarah said, and now her voice had an edge to it, an anger I had never heard before. "Everything was about how hard she worked for me, how much she sacrificed, how she deserved my gratitude and attention. It was like emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail. Every sacrifice I made, every extra job I worked, every time I went without something I wanted so Sarah could have something she needed. She saw it as manipulation instead of love. And the money," Sarah continued, warming to her subject now. "She was always tight with money, always talking about how expensive things were, making me feel guilty for every penny she spent on me. But then she would turn around and offer to help pay for things I never asked for help with, and when I said no, she would act hurt and martyred." I remembered those conversations differently. I remembered worrying that Sarah was struggling financially, wanting to help but not wanting to wound her pride. I remembered offering to help with her car payment when she mentioned having trouble making ends meet, and how she had snapped at me that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. The worst part, Sarah said, and I could tell she was really getting into this now, letting out feelings she had kept bottled up for years, is that she never tried to understand my life or what was important to me. She just wanted me to be grateful for everything she did and to make her feel needed and appreciated. Some people are just takers, Jessica said. They give but only so they can demand something back. It's not really generosity if there are strings attached. Strings attached. Every hug I gave Sarah, every meal I cooked for her, every time I told her I was proud of her, she thought there were strings attached. I feel terrible saying this, Sarah went on, but part of me is glad she's gone. I won't have to pretend anymore. I won't have to fake interest in her stories about the neighbors or her health problems or her memories of Dad. I won't have to feel guilty for living my own life instead of being her emotional support system. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My daughter, my baby girl, the child I carried for 9 months, raised for 18 years and loved for 32, was glad I was dead. You know what the really sad part is? Sarah said finally. I don't think she ever really knew me. She loved this idea of who she wanted me to be, but she never bothered to find out who I actually was. Every conversation was about her feelings, her needs, her worries. She talked at me, not with me. That's narcissistic behavior, Jessica said. Some parents never see their children as separate people with their own lives and feelings. Narcissistic. The word felt like a slap across the face. I've been in therapy for 3 years, Sarah continued, trying to deal with the guilt and resentment. My therapist says it's normal to have complicated feelings about parents who are emotionally demanding. She says I need to forgive myself for not being the daughter my mother wanted me to be. 3 years. Sarah had been in therapy for 3 years talking to a stranger about how much she resented me, and I never knew. All those times I asked her how she was doing and she said, fine. She was actually in pain that I had caused. Well, now you're free, Jessica said. You can finally live your life without feeling guilty about it. Yeah, Sarah agreed, and I could hear the relief in her voice. I can. They talked for a few more minutes about practical things. The will, the house, what Sarah would do with my belongings. She mentioned wanting to sell the house as soon as possible because it held too many bad memories. She talked about donating most of my clothes and furniture to charity because she didn't want any of it in her apartment. The only thing she planned to keep was a small jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother on Robert's side. Not because it reminded her of me, but because it was an antique that might be worth something someday. As Jessica prepared to leave, she gave Sarah another hug. Remember, she said, you don't owe anyone your grief. You feel what you feel and that's okay. Thank you, Sarah said. I needed to hear that. After Jessica left, the funeral home grew quiet. The funeral director turned off most of the lights and told Sarah she could take a few more minutes if she wanted to. I hoped maybe now, alone with me, she might show some real emotion. Maybe she would hold my hand or whisper something private, something that would help me understand that despite everything she had said, there was still some love left between us. Instead, she walked over to my casket and stood there for maybe 30 seconds, not saying anything at all. Then I heard her footsteps walking away, heard the door close behind her, heard the lock turn. And I was alone with the truth. My daughter didn't just not love me, she was relieved that I was dead. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship, everything I had believed about motherhood and sacrifice and unconditional love, had been a lie I told myself. The worst part wasn't that Sarah didn't love me. The worst part was that maybe she was right. Maybe I had been suffocating and demanding and narcissistic. Maybe I had been so focused on being needed that I forgot to simply love her without expecting anything in return. Maybe the mother I thought I was and the mother she experienced were two completely different people. As I lay there in that dark flower-scented room, I realized that I was about to be buried with so many words left unsaid, so many truths left unspoken. Sarah would go on with her life, finally free from the burden of pretending to love me, and I would go into the ground never knowing if there had been any way to bridge the gap between us. But sometimes, friends, when you think you've heard the worst truth possible, life has one more surprise waiting for you. Sometimes the story isn't over, even when you're lying in a casket wearing your best blue dress. Sometimes someone who really knows you decides to speak up, and everything you thought you understood about your life gets turned upside down. I was about to learn that the conversation between Sarah and Jessica was just the beginning of the revelations that night would bring. I thought the funeral home was empty, thought I would spend the rest of that long night alone with Sarah's terrible words echoing in my head. But sometimes, dear friends, God sends us angels when we need them most, even when we're lying in a casket thinking our story is over. If you've ever had someone stand up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself, you know how precious that moment can be. Please take a second to hit that like button if you believe that truth has a way of coming out, even in the darkest times. About 10 minutes after Sarah left, I heard the front door of the funeral home open again. At first I thought maybe she had come back, maybe she had forgotten something or wanted to say a proper goodbye. But the footsteps were different, slower, more careful, with the tap-tap of a walking cane on the polished floor. "I know you're closed," came a familiar voice, "but I have a key from when I used to clean this place and there's something I need to do. Mrs. My dear neighbor Mrs. Wilson had come back. I heard her talking to someone and then I realized she wasn't alone. "Come on in, girls," she said. "We won't take long, but this can't wait until tomorrow." Two other sets of footsteps entered the funeral home, and I recognized the voices immediately. Mrs. Patterson from the community center and Helen Rodriguez from church. Three of the women who had known me longest, who had seen me through Robert's death and Sarah's growing distance over the past 5 years. "Are you sure about this, Dorothy?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "It feels wrong being here after hours." "What's wrong, Mrs. Wilson said firmly, "is letting that girl bury her mother tomorrow without knowing the truth. Margaret was my friend for 20 years. And I won't let her go into the ground with her daughter thinking she was some kind of selfish, demanding woman." I felt a warmth spread through my chest, the first good feeling I'd had since this nightmare began. I heard every word of what Sarah said to that friend of hers, Mrs. Wilson continued, walking closer to my casket. Every single word. And most of it was lies, or at least half-truths that painted Margaret in the worst possible light. "What did she say?" Helen asked. Mrs. Wilson's voice got tight with anger. "She said her mother was suffocating, that she was emotionally demanding, that she never tried to understand Sarah's life. She said Margaret was narcissistic and manipulative, always guilt-tripping her about money and attention." "That doesn't sound like the Margaret I knew, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Because it wasn't, Mrs. Wilson replied. "And tomorrow, before they close that casket for good, I'm going to make sure Sarah knows what her mother really did for her, what she really sacrificed, and how wrong she's been about everything." My heart was pounding so hard I thought surely they could hear it. Mrs. Wilson knew something that could change how Sarah saw me. "Tell us," Helen said. "What don't we know?" Mrs. Wilson sighed deeply, and I could picture her settling into one of the chairs near my casket. "Where do I start? How about with the college money Sarah thinks her mother was so stingy about?" She paused, gathering her thoughts, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Margaret never told Sarah this, but she didn't just work 3 jobs to help pay for college. She sold her engagement ring. That beautiful diamond ring that Robert gave her when they got engaged. She sold it to a pawn shop to make Sarah's first semester payment when the scholarship money was late coming through." I heard one of them gasp softly. "And that's not all, Mrs. Wilson continued. You know that car accident Sarah had in her junior year? The one where her car was totaled and she needed money for a new one right away." "I remember," Mrs. Patterson said. "She got that reliable Honda that lasted her through graduation. Margaret sold her piano for that car. That old upright piano that her own mother had given her, the one she learned to play as a child. She loved that piano, used to play hymns on Sunday afternoons when she thought nobody was listening. But Sarah needed a car, so the piano had to go." I wanted to cry, but dead people can't cry. I had forgotten about the piano, forgotten about the sadness I felt watching strangers carry it out of my living room. I told Sarah it was just taking up space, that I never played it anymore anyway. I couldn't let her know that I had to sell it, couldn't let her feel guilty about needing help. "But surely Sarah knew her mother was struggling financially," Helen said. "That's just it, Mrs. Wilson replied. "Margaret made sure she never knew. She worked herself to the bone to hide how hard things really were. You remember when she was cleaning those office buildings at night? She was always so tired," Mrs. Patterson said. "But she never complained. She never complained because she didn't want Sarah to worry or feel guilty. But I lived next door and I saw the lights on in those buildings all night long. Margaret would come home at 6 in the morning, take a shower and then go to her day job at the grocery store. She was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep for 2 solid years. Why didn't she tell Sarah she was working so hard? Helen asked. Because, Mrs. Wilson said, and I could hear the tears in her voice now. She wanted Sarah to focus on her studies, to have a normal college experience without worrying about money. Every time Sarah called home stressed about exams or papers, Margaret would tell her everything was fine at home, that she was managing just perfectly. Mrs. Wilson stood up and I heard her walking around my casket, her cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. And another thing Sarah got wrong, all that talk about her mother being emotionally demanding and needy. Do you know what Margaret did when Robert died? What? Both women asked. She was falling apart, absolutely falling apart. I found her in her backyard at 2 in the morning 3 days after the funeral, still in her black dress, just sitting in Robert's garden chair crying like her heart was broken. Which it was. I remembered that night. The loneliness had been so overwhelming I couldn't stay in the house with all of Robert's things, couldn't bear the silence where his voice used to be. But when Sarah called to check on her, Mrs. Wilson continued, what do you think Margaret said? Did she tell her daughter she was struggling? Did she ask for help or comfort or even just someone to talk to? What did she say? Mrs. Patterson asked softly. She said she was doing fine, that Sarah shouldn't worry about her, that she was staying busy with her garden and her volunteering. She made Sarah think she was handling Robert's death just fine because she didn't want to be a burden. Oh, Margaret, Helen whispered. For 5 years, Mrs. Wilson said, her voice getting stronger. Margaret protected that girl from the truth about how lonely she was, how much she was struggling financially, how worried she was about her health. She never wanted to be the needy, demanding mother Sarah accused her of being tonight. Mrs. Wilson was walking again, pacing like she did when she was really worked up about something. And let me tell you something else Sarah doesn't know, she said. All those care packages she sent? All those cookies and homemade treats that Sarah thought were too much, too frequent. What about them? Helen asked. Margaret was skipping meals to afford the ingredients. I watched her getting thinner and thinner, but every month like clockwork she would send Sarah a box full of her favorite things. And when Sarah would call and barely thank her, sometimes not even mentioning the package at all, Margaret would make excuses for her. She's so busy with work, she would say. Young people today don't have time for long phone calls. Mrs. Patterson made a sound of distress. She was making excuses for Sarah's rudeness? Always, Mrs. Wilson confirmed. Even when it was clear that Sarah was pulling away, Margaret kept making excuses. She convinced herself that Sarah was just busy, just focused on building her career, just going through a phase. But didn't Margaret ever get angry? Helen asked. Didn't she ever confront Sarah about how she was being treated? Mrs. Wilson was quiet for a moment and I could almost see her shaking her head. That's the saddest part of all, she finally said. Margaret blamed herself. She thought she had failed as a mother. She would sit in my kitchen drinking coffee and analyzing every conversation with Sarah, looking for ways she had said the wrong thing or asked for too much. That's heartbreaking, Mrs. Patterson said. She kept a notebook, Mrs. Wilson continued, and my heart stopped. A little blue notebook where she would write down things she wanted to remember to ask Sarah about, or topics she thought might interest her. She studied that girl's life like it was a foreign language she was trying to learn. I had forgotten about that notebook. Every phone call I would have it beside me, full of questions about Sarah's job, her friends, her interests. But the conversations were always so short, so one-sided, that I rarely got to ask even half of what I had written down. And when Sarah started calling less and less, Mrs. Wilson said, Margaret convinced herself it was because she was boring, that she didn't have anything interesting enough to say to hold her daughter's attention. But Margaret was never boring, Helen protested. She was one of the kindest, most interesting women I knew. I know that and you know that, but Sarah made her feel like she was just a burden, a duty to be endured. And Margaret, being the person she was, took all the blame on herself instead of seeing that her daughter was being selfish and ungrateful. Mrs. Wilson's voice was getting louder now, more passionate. Do you want to know the real truth about Margaret's health problems? The ones Sarah thinks she complained about too much. Tell us, Both women said. Margaret was having chest pains for months before that first heart attack. Months. But she didn't tell Sarah because she didn't want to worry her or seem like she was asking for attention. She would call me instead, scared and in pain, asking if I thought she should go to the hospital. And what would you tell her? Mrs. Patterson asked. I told her to call Sarah to let her daughter know what was happening. But Margaret would always say no, that Sarah had enough stress in her life without worrying about her mother's health problems. I remembered those conversations, remembered the fear in Mrs. Wilson's voice when she begged me to get medical help. But I couldn't bear the thought of Sarah feeling obligated to take care of me, couldn't stand the idea of becoming the needy, demanding mother I was afraid she already thought I was. Even the day of the big heart attack, Mrs. Wilson continued, when I found her collapsed in the garden, you know what she whispered to me in the ambulance? Don't tell Sarah it's serious. I don't want her to worry. She was protecting Sarah even then, Helen said, and I could hear that she was crying. Right up until the end, Mrs. Wilson agreed. Even when she was dying, she was more worried about being a burden to her daughter than about her own pain and fear. The three women were quiet for a few minutes and I could hear them crying softly. Then Mrs. Wilson spoke again and her voice was different now, determined and strong. Sarah is going to hear all of this tomorrow before the funeral starts. She's going to know what kind of mother she really had and what kind of daughter she's been. I won't let Margaret go into the ground with her child thinking she was anything less than the most loving, selfless woman who ever lived. But Dorothy, Mrs. Patterson said gently, will it change anything? Will Sarah even believe you? She'll believe me, Mrs. Wilson said grimly, because I have proof. Proof? What proof could Mrs. Wilson possibly have? Remember when Margaret had that first heart attack 3 months ago? When she was in the hospital for 3 days. Of course, Helen said. Margaret asked me to go to her house and get some things she needed. She gave me the key and told me to look in her bedroom dresser for clean nightgowns and slippers. Mrs. Wilson paused and I heard her rustling through what sounded like a purse or bag. I found the nightgowns, she continued, but I also found something else. A box hidden in the back of her drawer, full of things Sarah never knew about. My heart started racing again. The box. I had forgotten about the box. What kind of things? Mrs. Patterson asked. Letters, Mrs. Wilson said. Letters Margaret wrote to Sarah but never sent. Dozens of them written over the past 5 years. Letters about how much she missed Robert, how lonely she was, how proud she was of Sarah's accomplishments, how sorry she was if she had somehow failed as a mother. She had found my letters. The letters I wrote when the loneliness became too much to bear, when I needed to tell Sarah how I felt but couldn't risk pushing her further away. And there were other things too, Mrs. Wilson continued. Receipts from the pawn shop where she sold her ring. The title transfer when she sold her car and started taking the bus everywhere so she could help Sarah with her student loans. Medical bills she never told Sarah about, bills she was paying off $5 at a time so she wouldn't have to ask for help. Oh my goodness, Helen whispered. And pictures, Mrs. Wilson said. Pictures Sarah had sent over the years, maybe a dozen total, that Margaret had kept in this special box like they were made of gold. Pictures from Sarah's college graduation, from work parties, from trips she took with friends. Margaret treasured every single one, even though Sarah never sent them with letters or explanations, just stuck them in cards with her signature. I remembered those pictures, how carefully I had preserved each one, how I would take them out and look at them when I missed Sarah too much to bear. There's also a copy of Margaret's will in that box, Mrs. Wilson said quietly. Did you know she left everything to Sarah? The house, her small savings account, her jewelry, everything. And there's a letter with the will explaining that she hoped Sarah would keep the house because it held so many good memories of their life together. Good memories. I had been so focused on the good memories, on the happy times when Sarah was little and still loved spending time with me. I thought maybe if I left her the house, she would remember those times and understand how much she had meant to me. Margaret even wrote out instructions for her own funeral, Mrs. Wilson continued, asking that it be simple and inexpensive so Sarah wouldn't have to spend much money. She picked out the least expensive casket package and asked to be buried next to Robert in the plot she had already paid for, so Sarah wouldn't have any financial burden. Even in death, I had tried to protect her from expense and trouble. I'm bringing all of this to the funeral tomorrow, Mrs. Wilson said firmly. Every letter, every receipt, every picture. Sarah is going to see the truth about her mother, and she's going to understand what real love looks like. Do you think it will make a difference? Mrs. Patterson asked. I don't know, Mrs. Wilson admitted. But Margaret deserves to have the truth told. She deserves to have someone speak up for her, to show the world what kind of person she really was. Even if Sarah can't appreciate it now, someday she might. Someday she might need to know that her mother loved her more than her own life. The three women sat in silence for a few more minutes, and then I heard them getting ready to leave. But before they went, Mrs. Wilson came close to my casket one more time. I'm sorry, Margaret, she whispered. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I'm sorry I let you blame yourself for Sarah's coldness when it was never your fault. You were the best mother that girl could have asked for, and tomorrow everyone is going to know it. As their footsteps faded away and the funeral home grew quiet again, I lay there in the darkness with a heart that felt both broken and hopeful at the same time. Mrs. Wilson was right. I had protected Sarah from so much, had sacrificed so much, had loved her so completely that I forgot to take care of myself. But would it matter? Would knowing the truth change anything for Sarah? Or would she just see it as more evidence of the suffocating, demanding mother she thought I had been? I was about to find out because morning was coming, and with it the conversation that would change everything between my daughter and me, even if I was supposed to be dead. The morning of my funeral arrived gray and cold, with the kind of drizzle that makes everything look sad and washed out. I could hear the funeral home coming to life around me. Workers arranging flowers, the funeral director checking arrangements, the soft sound of people beginning to gather in the main room. My heart was racing, if hearts can race when you're supposed to be dead, because I knew that in a few hours Mrs. Wilson was going to change everything. But friends, let me tell you something about miracles. They don't always happen the way we expect them to. Sometimes God has a plan that's bigger than anything we could imagine, and sometimes the greatest gift isn't getting what we want but getting what we need. If you believe in second chances and the power of truth to heal broken hearts, please hit that subscribe button, because what happened next will stay with you long after this story ends. The service was scheduled to start at 10 o'clock, but people began arriving early. I could hear them filing into the chapel, their voices hushed and respectful. Mrs. Wilson was there, and I could practically feel her determination radiating across the room. She had positioned herself near the front, close to where Sarah would be sitting, and I knew she was clutching that box of evidence like a weapon. Sarah arrived exactly on time, neither early nor late, accompanied by her friend Jessica from the night before. I heard them talking quietly as they took their seats in the front row, Sarah thanking people for coming with that same polite, distant voice she had used at the viewing. The pastor began the service with a prayer, and then he invited people to share memories of me. Mrs. Patterson stood up first and talked about my volunteering at the community center, how I always stayed late to help clean up and never missed a single event. Helen Rodriguez shared a story about how I had brought her family meals for 2 weeks when her husband was in the hospital, never asking for anything in return. One by one, people stood up and painted a picture of a woman who cared deeply about others, who was always ready to help, who found joy in small acts of kindness. But through it all, Sarah sat silent, her face composed but distant, like she was listening to stories about someone she barely knew. Then Mrs. Wilson stood up. I'd like to say something about Margaret, she announced in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the chapel. But first I want to share some things that her daughter Sarah doesn't know, things Margaret kept secret because she loved her child more than her own comfort. I could feel the tension in the room shift. Sarah looked up sharply, probably wondering what Mrs. Wilson was going to say. Mrs. Wilson reached into the box beside her and pulled out the first piece of evidence. The pawn shop receipt for my engagement ring. Margaret sold her engagement ring to pay for Sarah's first semester of college when the scholarship money was delayed, she announced, holding up the receipt for everyone to see. She told Sarah it was just a loan from her savings, but the truth is she sold the most precious thing she owned to make sure her daughter could stay in school. I heard Sarah gasp, a small sound that carried clearly in the quiet chapel. And this, Mrs. Wilson continued, pulling out another paper, is the receipt from when Margaret sold her mother's piano to buy Sarah a car after her accident. That piano had been in Margaret's family for 3 generations, but Sarah needed transportation, so it had to go. Sarah was staring now, her composed mask beginning to crack. Mrs. Wilson reached into the box again and pulled out a handful of letters. My letters, the ones I wrote but never sent. For 5 years, she said, her voice getting stronger, Margaret wrote letters to her daughter. Letters about how much she missed her husband, how proud she was of Sarah's accomplishments, how sorry she was if she had somehow failed as a mother. But she never sent them because she didn't want to burden Sarah with her loneliness. Mrs. Wilson opened one of the letters and began to read. My dearest Sarah, I know you're busy with your important life in the city, but I wanted you to know that I saw the sunrise this morning and it reminded me of the mornings when you were little and would crawl into bed with Daddy and me to watch the light come through our bedroom window. I miss those simple times when being together was enough. I hope someday you'll have a daughter who brings you as much joy as you brought me, even though I know I didn't always show it the right way. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. But Mrs. Wilson wasn't finished. She pulled out medical bills, showing how I had been hiding my health problems to avoid worrying Sarah. She showed work schedules that proved I had been working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs while telling Sarah everything was fine financially. She displayed every piece of evidence of my sacrifices, my love, my desperate attempts to be the mother Sarah needed without being the burden I was terrified of becoming. The truth is, Mrs. Wilson said, looking directly at Sarah now, your mother spent the last 5 years of her life trying to love you without bothering you. She worked herself to exhaustion, sold her most precious possessions, and hid her pain and loneliness because she wanted you to be free to live your own life without feeling guilty or obligated. Sarah was crying openly now, her composure completely shattered. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know any of this. Of course you didn't know, Mrs. Wilson said, but her voice was gentle now, not accusing. Because your mother made sure you didn't know. She protected you from her struggles the same way she protected you from everything else your whole life. And that's when something impossible happened. As I lay there listening to the truth being told, feeling Sarah's pain and regret wash over me like a warm wave, I felt something stirring in my chest. Not my heart. The doctors had been clear that my heart was barely functioning. This was something deeper, something that felt like hope mixed with forgiveness, mixed with a love so strong it could move mountains. The stirring grew stronger and suddenly I could feel my fingers. Actually feel them warm and alive. Then my toes. Then a tingling sensation that spread through my whole body like electricity. I heard Mrs. Wilson gasp, then other people in the chapel making sounds of surprise and confusion. As I was moving, my eyes were opening. I was sitting up in my casket, very much alive, looking directly at my daughter's tear-stained face. Sarah, I whispered, and my voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. The chapel erupted in chaos. People were shouting, crying, some were running for the doors. The funeral director was frantically calling for an ambulance. But I only had eyes for Sarah, who was staring at me like she had seen a ghost. Which I suppose she had. Mom? She said, her voice broken and small like she was 8 years old again. I'm here, baby, I said, though I don't know how I found the strength to speak. I'm here. Sarah stumbled forward, pushing past the funeral director and the pastor, and fell to her knees beside my casket. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't know, I didn't understand, I thought you were. Shoo, I said, reaching out to touch her face with a hand that shouldn't have been able to move. I know what you thought. And maybe you were a little bit right. No, Sarah said fiercely. No, I was wrong about everything. You were never demanding or suffocating. You were just loving me the only way you knew how, and I was too selfish and stubborn to see it. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and suddenly the chapel was full of paramedics checking my pulse and blood pressure and asking me questions I couldn't really answer. How do you explain that love brought you back from the dead? How do you tell medical professionals that sometimes miracles happen when broken hearts finally find their way back to each other? They transported me to the hospital, with Sarah riding in the ambulance holding my hand and crying harder than I had ever seen her cry. The doctors ran test after test trying to understand what had happened. My heart function had improved dramatically. My brain activity was completely normal. By every medical standard I should have still been in a coma, but there I was, awake and talking and very much alive. It's unprecedented, Martinez told Sarah later that day. I've never seen recovery like this from the kind of damage your mother sustained. Medically speaking, it shouldn't be possible. But Sarah and I knew it wasn't about medicine. It was about truth and forgiveness and the kind of love that's strong enough to wake the dead. During my 3 days in the hospital, Sarah never left my side. She read me every letter I had written but never sent, crying over each one. She made phone calls to arrange time off from work, something she had never done before when I was sick. She brought me flowers from my own garden and sat with me while I told her stories about her childhood that I had never shared before. "Why didn't you ever tell me about selling your ring?" she asked on the second day. "Because I didn't want you to feel guilty," I said honestly. "I wanted you to focus on your studies and your dreams, not worry about an old woman's sacrifices." "But I had a right to know," Sarah said. "I had a right to make my own choices about whether to accept that kind of help." She was right, of course. In trying to protect her from guilt, I had also protected her from the opportunity to show gratitude, to understand the depth of my love, to make her own decisions about our relationship. "I was so afraid of being a burden," I admitted. "So afraid that if you knew how much I was struggling, you would feel trapped by obligation instead of love." "But Mom," Sarah said, taking my hand, "don't you see? By hiding everything from me, you made me think you didn't need me at all. I thought you were fine without me, that my presence in your life was just extra. Something you wanted but didn't really need." It was true. In my desperate attempt not to be needy, I had convinced my daughter that I didn't need her at all. "I always needed you," I whispered. "I just didn't know how to say it without sounding desperate." Sarah squeezed my hand. "And I always loved you. I just didn't know how to show it without feeling like I was losing myself." We cried together then, mother and daughter, finally understanding each other after years of missing each other completely. On my 3rd day in the hospital, Sarah brought me something that made my heart sing. She had gone to my house and found the little blue notebook where I had written down questions and topics for our phone calls. "I want to answer every single question in here," she said. "I want to tell you about my job, my friends, my dreams, my fears. I want to share my life with you the way I should have been doing all along." And she did. Over the following weeks, as I recovered at home with Sarah staying in her old bedroom, we had the conversations we should have been having for years. She told me about her work, which was more interesting than I had ever imagined. She told me about her friends, including Jessica, who came to apologize for encouraging Sarah's distance from me. She told me about the men she had dated, the dreams she had for the future, the fears that kept her awake at night. And I listened, really listened, without trying to fix everything or give unwanted advice or make it all about my own experiences. In return, I told her about my loneliness after her father died, about how proud I was of her accomplishments, about how much I had missed the little girl who used to tell me everything. I showed her pictures she had never seen, told her stories about her childhood that I had kept locked in my heart, shared memories of her father that I had been saving for the right moment. Most importantly, we learned how to love each other without fear. Sarah learned that caring for her mother didn't make her weak or trapped. It made her generous and loving. And I learned that needing my daughter didn't make me a burden. It made me human. 6 months later, Sarah moved back to Portland. Not to take care of me, I made that very clear, but to be close to family, to rebuild the relationship we had almost lost forever. She kept her job and her independence, but she also made time for Sunday dinners and garden talks and the kind of easy companionship I had dreamed of for years. Mrs. Wilson still comes over for coffee, but now Sarah joins us sometimes, and the 3 of us laugh about how stubborn we all were, how close we came to losing each other to pride and misunderstanding and fear. People ask me all the time what it was like to die and come back, whether I saw a bright light or felt at peace. The truth is, I don't remember much about being dead. But I remember perfectly what it felt like to come back to life, to wake up to forgiveness and understanding and a love that was finally brave enough to speak its name. If you're watching this and you have someone in your life that you love but don't know how to reach, don't wait for a miracle. Don't wait for a funeral to tell the truth. Don't let pride or fear or misunderstanding keep you from the people who matter most. Love is not about being perfect. It's not about never making mistakes or never hurting each other. Love is about showing up, telling the truth, and choosing each other over and over again, even when it's hard, even when you don't understand each other, even when you're afraid. Sarah and I lost 5 years to fear and misunderstanding, but we didn't lose each other. And if an old woman like me can come back from the dead to save her relationship with her daughter, then maybe there's hope for any relationship that still has love at its core. Please, if this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about family, forgiveness, and the miracles that happen when we're brave enough to love without conditions. And remember, it's never too late to tell someone you love them. It's never too late to ask for forgiveness. It's never too late to start over. Because sometimes when love is strong enough and truth is brave enough, even death isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a new chapter, one written with honesty and grace and the kind of love that can wake the dead.